Thank you, Anna, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been involved with this enterprise, I think nearly from the beginning, and I just want to say that it's an honor to be part of it, and I want to thank Victor Fung for all he's done for for Hong Kong, for international business, for so many things. The list goes on, and I'm thrilled to be his sidekick. I'm called the co-chairman, but if you went to the meeting, you'd really discover who the chairman is. I was given the title, as you will see from your program, Building a Durable Framework for a Digital Global Economy. And my first reaction to that was to say good luck and then invite questions from the audience. But I think I probably ought to do a little bit more than that. So let me do the best I can in the 20 minutes that's been allotted to me. I think most of us would agree that the international order that we have lived under for most of the post-war period may survive, but it's not going to survive, unchanged. It will take fairly substantial alteration to make it suitable for purpose in the modern world. So I'd like to start with what I think of as megatrends, or at least big trends that are important. And I mention these because I think they directly affect any reasonable or feasible architecture for a globally constructed world. On the one hand, or even they directly affect our ability to get there from here. I think the single most important one, and the first two are what Victor just mentioned, is the rise of Asia and the developing world. I mean, this affects everything. It affects the location of demand. It affects economic power. It affects global supply chains and a host of other things. And it is true that the economic mass is shifting to Asia. The second one is that I would say at different paces, most economies are in the process of being built in part on digital foundations. And this is a change in mindset. 10 years ago, if you said digital technology, most people would think of sectors and services and markets and something that's part of the economy, but they wouldn't automatically think that you couldn't turn anywhere and not find digital technology as an important part of the process of building the economy. The third one Victor also mentioned is rising inequality in income and wealth and opportunity. That is very widespread, if not ubiquitous. The fourth is related, I think, although I wouldn't say it's direct cause and effect. There's a very widespread pattern of political and social fragmentation that involves the rejection of established governing structures and groups, elites, established parties, institutions of a variety of kinds, and so on. The fifth one is the sustainability challenges. These are, new in the sweep of history, I think. That is, we have now got to the point where we have to take these things seriously. And I think we are, the way I describe this to myself is that we've lived in a world in which whenever we talk about measuring what's going on, we use flows. And I think we've got to the end of the era in which we simply ignore balance sheets. That is, assets, liabilities, and other things that are, key elements of thinking precisely and in a clear-headed way about sustainability. The sixth one is that there are tensions associated with technology's role in the world because, for lots of reasons, but mainly, I think, because there's a real tension between the way technology operates in society and the economy on the one hand, and its increasingly central importance in an overlapping way in national security and defense. These are completely different kinds of incentive structures and games, and I use that term in the technical sense, not because it's a game. And finally, I think there is a growing conflict between people's desire for what I think of as localism, for localism in governance, in culture, in how they identify themselves vis-a-vis other people on the one hand, and the, what you might call the anonymity of the economics of a relatively open global economy. Now, every one of those things I mentioned has, millions and millions of words written about it, and this morning is not the time to sort of set out to sort of disentangle many of these things, although I am hoping in the course of the conference that we do actually make some progress in sort of bringing some order to some of these things. But in this context, I think you can ask, two kinds of questions. One is, what would a new digitally enabled global economy look like? One that, and by that I mean precisely, one that's responsive to the needs and trends and implied constraints in the 7 things I just mentioned. And the second question I think is more difficult. It's the one that demotivates me fairly frequently when I ask it to myself, and it is, with the present status quo as a starting point, is there any reasonable chance of constructing such a system? And if so, how do we get started on doing it from this starting point? In other words, where do we go, question 1, and how do we get there? I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the digital side of things because I think while there's an enormous amount of talk about it, there's some characteristics of digital technologies and the way they operate in economies that are fairly important. There's a fair amount of data now on how digitized our economies are. By sector and by business, there are leaders and laggards, but I think this is all transitional. And the result is inevitable, and the reason is that the digital technologies have extraordinarily power. They're wildly efficient in certain applications. They are, in some dimensions, extraordinarily inclusive because they sort of deal with things like remoteness and time and, delays and distance and so on. And there's lots of examples of that, increasingly well studied. And I suspect that digital technologies will be an important element in the sustainability agenda as well. Let me give an example. Mobile payments is spreading around the world. It's most highly developed in China. It's a very, very good system because it economizes on, it uses existing, infrastructure and technology. It does not require small, retailers and business owners to buy equipment that becomes obsolete sort of next year. It's really a brilliant design. It also has the following characteristics, that the cost per transaction are approximately 1/6 of the cost per transaction in the credit card companies. That number may not be perfectly accurate, but that's an unovercomable advantage. and then built around that, in a modern AI sense, data-intensive world, is a whole set of capabilities. So, for example, I've had some association with a company based in Hangzhou, 30% owned by Ant Financial, called MyBank. MyBank has 17 million small business customers. They're adding, I don't know, 1 million or 2 every month. The average number of employees in those companies is 5, right? They have no track record, for the most part, no collateral, nothing that would enable a bank to lend them money, right? And so, you're going to hear this from me more than once today. So the importance of this may or may not be show up in growth in the economy, but it'll sure show up in any reasonable dimension of inclusiveness. And I personally believe, so I'll just say it flat out, that when historians look back at digital technology, they're going to discover that the inclusive element is as important, maybe even more important, than the effects on productivity and growth, which frankly haven't showed up in any data yet. Another example, and I won't do too many of these, but I've been sort of cataloging, uses of artificial intelligence, and in particular, big general purpose technologies like image recognition in healthcare. And I think almost everybody agrees that healthcare is going to have experience an enormous impact from digital technology. So it turns out that, using this image recognition technology, you can identify things like skin cancer reasonably accurately. And you can diagnose diabetic retinopathy, which is an ailment that is associated with diabetes that, if undetected early, causes blindness. It's a very big problem in India. And so you might say, for those of us who live in Hong Kong or New York or, a major city, probably think, well, that's, sort of interesting, but I'm still going to a dermatologist or an ophthalmologist. But 85% or more of the world's population can't do that because they don't live near. And so the real impact of these is to dramatically expand this dimension, diagnostic dimension of primary care. It's really pretty exciting what's going on. So let me shift gears slightly. One thing I really want to emphasize is the cost characteristics of the digital technologies, especially these big general purpose ones. These are high fixed, high development costs, and very low variable costs, marginal costs, right? And the bigger the sort of space or scope of the application, the lower the costs become. That skin cancer example that I gave you wouldn't have happened if Google hadn't simply lent the image recognition software to these kids at Stanford, right? It cost $1 billion to sort of make the thing. You can't have $1 billion spent every time you're going to sort of do one of the, but you don't have to, right, is the point. Now, this has lots of consequences. One of them is that almost a great deal of the impact of this in the economy, in the conventional measures, and outside it are not going to show up in GDP data. They're just not. Everyone in this room is either has a 1980s computer in their pocket or you're looking at it. And that thing costs less than a desktop computer that wasn't connected to the internet in the 1980s. And it does a whole lot of things and provides you with services, most of which are free. That's just not ever going to show up in GDP. Now, there's a whole lot of measurement problems, and Fred Hu and I are trying to write something, about this, so we don't kind of get off on the wrong track in kind of thinking about the benefits on the cost side by poorly measuring the benefits. But that's a kind of separate and slightly technical subject. But the main point, I think, here is that we are living in a world that I have come to think of as an invisible revolution. That it's a revolution, we all know it's going on. Every business person in the world is either in the process of developing a digital strategy or finding a consultant to help them sort of think about what that means. And yet, it's going to show up in conventional measures of economic performance, either with a lag and probably at well below its impact. Another quick observation is, I think you all know this, data really matters in this, especially in the kind of modern applications, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that means that innovation is going to occur in the applications, not the theory, in the applications in and around the people who have access to that data. Now that, I think, has come to be pretty well understood in the business world, and that there's going to be sort of a gold rush in that dimension, I think. But it has lots of implications. One is that, there's tremendous amount of market power around the platforms where a lot of this data occurs. Second, innovation tends to occur around those platforms, and it has military applications, so that Google finds itself in the uncomfortable position of thinking of itself as, or wondering, and its employees wondering if they want to be a defense contractor. And so on. There are many dimensions of this, some better studied than others, that have to do with the application of this data. So, for example, some friends of mine believe that digitally enabled and architected platforms, the ecosystems around them, are actually a new form of organization. That is, Ronald Coase received the Nobel Prize for saying that markets don't solve certain coordination problems very well, and that defines the boundary between markets and the world, the corporate world, the business world, where you can coordinate economic activity. It looks like these digitally enabled platforms shift that boundary. Doesn't make Coase irrelevant, but it shifts the boundary in the direction of the markets. So, and you can see this. I mean, detailed studies of the ecosystems in these relatively open platforms seem to have this characteristic that you can do things with markets that you didn't do before. There's all kinds of other things. Sam Palmisano and I have talked about the fact that it's pretty hard to know where your competitors are going to come from in the future. I mean, if you think you know what industry you're in and whatnot, you probably want to think again and scan on a broader horizon, because somebody might arrive, and you all know. I mean, I don't think most of us would have said that the platforms are going to be an epicenter of autonomous vehicles several years ago. I doubt very much if the people, who are driving horse-driven carriages in New York thought that a guy with a steam engine and 4 wheels was going to put them out of business back 100 years ago, but that's the reality. So, what are the things we need to be done? One, I think we have to take seriously this measurement. I know it's an old saw, but we have this persistent tendency that Victor adverted to of saying, well, well-being is multidimensional, and then not persistently measuring it and reporting it to ourselves, and then we fall back, right? And even now, if you listen carefully to the discussion of digital technology, one of the main subjects is, why isn't it showing up in productivity? And I don't think that's, to be honest, I don't think that's the central question. I think it's showing up sort of somewhere else. I don't mean to dismiss that question. I do think there are elements of digital technology that will affect productivity in the ordinary sense, and that it'll show up with a lag. Second, the next 2 items are what I call the all hands on deck thing with respect to the challenges that we face. The inclusiveness ones, the sustainability ones. And part of that is a multi-stakeholder model, so that businesses are not alone, but are on the playing field, aligning business models with important social and economic objectives. And that's a creative exercise, in my view. There's not a formula, a template. That's just a starting point. And I think there's a lot of very well-intentioned business leaders who are up for this challenge and are going to help us move in that direction. The other element is you need everybody on the playing field, right? Government, business, labor, education, the civil society organizations, and so on, in order to solve some of these problems. And the reason is, I think, fairly easy to see. One aspect is innovation is not a centralized process. Governments aren't famous, for the most part, in innovating. Economics always said that business has a narrow agenda and governments solve, public good, social problems. That model has to be at least modified, or we're not going to solve these problems. And economics has to be modified to recognize that. And the third thing is that relevant information and knowledge is distributed in almost every sphere. And so if you assign the problem to one sector and the knowledge that you need to deal with it is distributed, then you've already handcuffed yourself before you even get started. My favorite example of this is the regulation of the financial sector, right? The financial sector itself has information about where risks are, how they need to be dealt with, that the regulators, might be able to get eventually. And Rob Johnson and his institute talk a lot about this kind of thing. So the question is, so what's the right regulatory structure? And I think the answer is, it's one that's more complicated than assigning it to a single sector. We are in the process of regulating, for good reasons, the internet and data, right? And this is completely different from where we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, this whole thing was kind of a big open system, And a few people knew that there were some people setting standards and protocols somewhere, anonymously out there. That's gone. And there's nothing in principle wrong with this, but there's some real challenges associated with it. So the agenda is internet content, data security and access, and so on. And maybe the abuse of market power, although that technically falls under a competition policy heading. So the way I see it, this regulation is coming, and it is in the absence of a serious international discussion of how to do this. It's being promulgated basically at the national level, and in the case of the EU, at the EU level, and is driven by perceived challenges and values. And there's, in my mind, very little chance that the regulations are going to look similar across these jurisdictions, which means, and Victor and I were together when I said this, that there's going to be some kind of balkanization of the internet. Now, when I said that, Victor and I were in Istanbul, and a very nice lady stuck up her hand and said, we're in the Balkans here. You might want to find a different term. It's a typical economist mistake. I think when I was here in the spring at an event, a few of us had the honor of receiving an honorary degree at Hong Kong University, and Jeffrey Ma, who is the senior justice in the final court of appeals in Hong Kong, which is the Hong Kong Supreme Court, gave a really wonderful short speech and basically said, we know that we're in the business of protecting and defending individual rights, but we also know that those rights defended, without qualification, impose on, have an effect on collective rights and interests. And we have to do that balancing act. And I think the way you think of what's going on is that different societies are in the early stages, in some cases, of doing this balancing act. And they won't come out the same for good reasons. They have different challenges, different issues with stability, different values, and so on. But I think, to say we can't get into this business and do what Jeffrey said they do and we have to do is simply wrong. On the national security front, I think this is a huge challenge. So let me simply say, right now the national security agenda is starting to sort of overwhelm the economic agenda. And so, and the costs of that, if pursued too far, I'm not dismissing the national security agendas at all. But the costs of that, if it got to the point of really disrupting a relatively open flow of knowledge and technology globally, would have enormous negative impacts on all kinds of countries, early stage developing countries. The system we've operated in, I don't know if anybody invented it, but it's just startlingly efficient. We don't have duplication of effort. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing. It's the world that, those of us who are academics kind of live in. And it has to be modified to some extent. But I think the challenge, if I can try to be a bit more precise, is we need to acknowledge the national security agenda issues because these technologies, especially the digital ones, are very important elements of not falling behind in defense and national security capabilities. But we have to find a way to insulate the social and economic side to some extent from contamination from those constraints and restrictions. And I think the way, I love the Chinese, I think we need a negative list, to use the Chinese term. We need a list of things that are agreed on multilaterally that you can think of as digital arms control. And they are commitments made by governments that they will not do certain things. Let me give an example. DJI is the leading maker of drones in the world. It's based in Shenzhen up here. Drones are pretty important in part of modern warfare, among other things. It's perfectly okay for the Chinese government to say to DJI, you can't sell military-capable drones to certain other, countries and customers. And we all do that now. We'll do it forever. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But what is not okay is to tell DJI to sell drones that are military-capable drones that have vulnerabilities built into them, unknowns to the buyers, to other countries, okay? Do you see the difference, right? And so I think if we work hard at it, we can think of ways to at least partially insulate this world. Final 2 points I have. None of what I have just said is going to happen unless we find a way to reverse the catastrophic trends toward rising inequality. And the reason's pretty simple. If we don't reverse those trends, then the domestic politics will be doing something completely different from engaging in sort of international sort of discussions. So I think of it as a prerequisite. It's not just another item on the agenda. If we don't get that done, and we have the kinds of politics and fragmentation and polarization and gridlock and all the other things you're familiar with on a very broad front, it's hard to imagine, the scenario in which we kind of come together and deal with this. And finally, harking back to something I said before, people aren't comfortable living in the global economy. They want to live in a community. They want to elect, pick people who govern them that have the power to affect the conditions under which they live, not be subjected without any intervention to anonymous, big, powerful global forces that seem to come from somewhere else. They probably want to control immigration and so on. And so I think that's just a reality. The new globalization has to be built around and accommodate local communities, because that's how people think of themselves and thrive emotionally. Victor asked me the other day, and I'll close with this, does this mean we have decoupling? Kind of a blunt question. And I think the answer to that question is yes, but I mean, we are going to have a partial decoupling. We have to accommodate the kinds of things that we're going to talk about for the next day. But I don't think it has to be, highly destructive. And so I think the agenda is to be realistic and acknowledge that some kind of decoupling is going to be required. There's just too many differences in the world and too many of these things that matter to people. But I think there's an agenda within that general framework that leads us. Bottom line is the global economy, that whether it's digital or not, and it surely will be digital, is going to be more complicated than the one we got used to. And I think the final comment on this would be, the old model of globalization was wise in its inception. Trade, specialization, and open flows of knowledge and technology, especially that last, have just dramatically changed the trajectory of the global economy in people's lives. Paul Romer received the Nobel Prize last year for talking about how important that last piece really is. Because knowledge, unlike almost everything else in the world, capital, goods, transferred from one person to another means they both have it. That's where power comes from. And it did an inestimable amount of good. But as it proceeded, so people thought, we did a wonderful thing, we'll just keep doing it. And the agenda of more and more openness, without these other considerations, finally kind of hit a wall. It sort of became, in a sense, naive. And so the challenge for us is, as I think it's a couple of decades worth of work, and maybe even a generation, is to reconstruct this thing to keep as best we can, the good parts, and it'll be a more complicated world. Thank you.